Months after the Protection of Personal Information, known as Popia Act, came into effect, South Africans are still receiving, call it, unsolicited calls and text messages. As Black Friday approaches this week, consumers are warned to be wary of unscrupulous telemarketers. The big question, though, is, do retailers go the extra mile to actually safeguard their customers' personal information? To break this down for you, let's bring in our guest, data management expert Gary Allemann joins us now via our video link for more on what you and I should be thinking. And Gary, it's great to have you on the program. Thanks very much indeed for making time. I want to begin by just gauging from you what consumers legally can do if they're still receiving these unsolicited calls and texts without giving the go-ahead, essentially, for those calls to actually be made.
Morning, Ayan, and thanks for having me. I think what consumers often don't realize, and quite honestly, a lot of corporates don't realize either, is that protection against unsolicited telemarketing has been protected since the days of the Consumer Protection Act. But what Popia has done is it has brought more teeth there's bigger consequences to organizations that break the rules. So the real question is to understand your rights, and very simplistically what your rights are is to be asked, if you ask somebody to do not call me, you ask somebody not to call you, then there should be consequences if they contact you after that point. So that's the real value of Popia, is that corporations are taking, or enterprises are taking, privacy more seriously, and they want you to have a good experience. So, I think we also need to recognize that business does need to market, does need to reach out, does need to make us aware of offers and opportunities that may be of interest to us. So it's really the question of when somebody is repeatedly contacting you when you've asked them not to, that for me personally is the biggest offense.
Right.
And that's where you can escalate it.
And you speak about consequences. I mean, what does that look like for ordinary citizens who don't feel that their autonomy is anything to go by in the face of these large retailers sometimes, which amass all kinds of power, including if matters were ever to land up in court, for example?
Well, the Protection of Personal Information Act effectively has two sets of consequences. So in the worst case scenario, there can be jail time for an executive or the responsible parties at an organization if they're repeatedly abusing personal data. And there are quite significant fines, up to a maximum of 10 million rand. So trust me when I say that corporations are taking this seriously, but in many large organizations you'll find their disconnect. So the real challenge that big companies have is to have a consistent policy that plays across all the business areas, and to ensure that marketing is allowed to do their job, but they're doing it in such a way as to not offend or break the law.
Yeah. Typically, when people evaluate whether or not any piece of legislation or regulations is a good regulation, you try to evaluate whether or not it's enforceable. I mean, given the experience we've had now, what's your sense around how enforceable Popia actually is, especially when it comes to holding people accountable for multiple transgressions?
So the Information Regulators Office has really been gearing up over the last year and a half, and I do believe we will start to see some cases come into courts. One of the challenges with Popia in comparison to, for example, GDPR, the European or equivalent European legislation, is Popia is a little bit more open to interpretation, whereas GDPR is very clear. So what that means is that at some point we're probably going to need to see a test case that will set the precedent that our case law will then be, will act on. So I do believe that there will be consequences at some point. Maybe not for an unsolicited phone call, but for example, for repeated infringements or for a clear lack of concern in protecting data that leads to a major breach. At some point, the regulator is going to have to set an example.
Yeah. Until that happens, perhaps it's worth understanding the terminology that's being used. Often people speak about data security, but there's also a term around data integrity. Something tells me those aren't necessarily interchangeable, are they?
No, they're not. And I'm going to add a third term, which is data privacy. So let me talk briefly about data integrity. So data integrity is about having useful data. It's about having data that is not only of high quality, but that we, so if we're working in an organization, we might capture certain customer information, but we can extend that information by, for example, bringing in third-party data, demographics. We might look at a store location and want to understand more about the kind of people that shop in the area. So that's all talking about data integrity. It's about having data that is useful. Data security is about making sure that data is protected. So it's about putting in place access controls, encryption, masking, and other measures to stop people from accessing data that should not have access to it. And data privacy then really is a subset of the two. It's kind of a combination. It's about saying, what is the purpose of this data and securing it appropriately? So, for example, if I'm the sales manager in an organization, I might need access to a large number of customers' information in order to make decisions about them or in order to ensure that they're being properly serviced. But if I'm an individual salesperson, I might only need access to that one customer's telephone number that I'm actually engaging with directly. So it becomes quite challenging for an organization, a large organization, to maintain privacy because it's context-driven.
Are we getting any better at managing it, though? I mean, we've seen multiple scandals involving multiple companies speaking about, and this is not just in South Africa, by the way, it's internationally as well. Some of these companies coming under fire for what in some instances is described as recklessness when it comes to putting the integrity of their customers' data at risk. Your work, your line of work, is it revealing to you that we're getting any better at protecting your and my data from getting in the hands of wrong people?
So I think there's a lot of focus. And I also think that to say it, well, what's true for me is a lot of organizations have kind of left these problems alone until they felt now that they've had to do it. But, you know, with Popia finally coming into enforcement, definitely there's some investment being made. However, the challenge of you know, it tends to be a lot of focus has been made on securing data from outside attack. So it's putting up firewalls, it's making sure that external parties can't get into our data. What's a bigger challenge to solve and where the real risk lies now is inappropriate access to data internally. So, for example, if I want to set up a reporting, you know, an analytics environment or analytics database, which is very critical to be able to help me to manage my customer experience, to launch relevant products, to you know, put my stores in a relevant location, etc., etc. I need to be able to ensure that the data that is in those reporting databases is accessible only to the people that need to see it. And that might mean different layers of access for different individuals. So a data scientist might need one layer of access and the analytics manager a different layer of access. That's the area where we're starting to see investment, and we're starting to see some quite exciting new technologies come out to enable that kind of nuanced access to data.
Gary Allemann, thanks very much indeed for breaking it down for us. It all can get quite complex, but following the story around data, something tells me, is of interest to everyone involved. So thanks very much indeed for breaking it down. Gary Allemann is a data management expert. Appreciate your time.